In this video, we're going to look at other people besides Martin Luther who fueled the ideas and contributed ideas to the Reformation. So, Ulrich Zwingli, a Swiss priest, was influenced by humanism, and he develops his own reformist theology and becomes an influential leader. Zwingli began advocating reform very soon after Martin Luther did, and although the two put forth similar concepts, Zwingli claimed that he had come up with his own ideas and that he had not copied Luther. So let's look at what Zwingli thought. He opposed church decorations because he felt they might distract people or promote idolatry. Consequently, he urged that all decorations and images be removed and that the walls of the church be whitewashed. He also saw music as a distraction, and he wanted to eliminate it from church services, even going as far as having organs smashed. And in contrast, Luther really loved music and wrote several hymns to be used in church services. Zwingli also did not want churches to retain any of the money they collected, and instead he insisted that all the money should go to aid the poor. He rejected the idea that both the Catholic Church and Luther concerning communion. He did not believe that the elements of communion, the bread and wine, became the literal body and blood of Christ, as Catholics did, that idea of transubstantiation, or that it took on mystical properties, as Luther claims, and instead he saw these merely as symbolic. So in 1519, Zwingli was appointed the people's priest of Zurich, the most powerful clerical position in the city, and he begins to institute reforms. And the changes that he made and the ideas that he preached created a stir among the Catholics in Zurich. And the city council decided to hold a disputation, a debate, to address the controversy and to hear the merits of Zwingli's positions. And at this disputation, Zwingli defended his ideas, and then Catholic priests argued why he was incorrect and why his ideas should be ignored. And the Catholics were not used to defending their ideas, and Zwingli made a number of very persuasive arguments. It's going to convince the city to allow him to continue to preach. The church and the government were tied together in Zurich under Zwingli, and since the city council had decreed that his ideas were to be followed, the mingling of church and state occurred. Zwingli held considerable influence over the council, and he convinces them to implement and enforce his ideas. Catholics were excluded under this theocracy, but the city council didn't want both Protestants and Catholics arguing over ideas and creating disharmony in Zurich. And so his ideas spread from Zurich into other cantons and promoting conflicts within the forest cantons that were Catholic. And so you have a real debate between those who follow Zwingli and the Catholics. Zwingli feared that these forest cantons would form an alliance against him and launch an attack on Zurich, and he hoped to ward this off by creating a similar alliance among Protestant cities, including German ones. So both Luther and Zwingli would have benefited from such an alliance because it would give them both a stronger military presence against those who opposed them. Philip of Hesse, a German noble who supported the Reformation, called a conference at Marburg to try to reconcile the differences between the views of Luther and Zwingli and create a unified Protestant theology. So the two leaders were able to reach a consensus on almost every issue except communion. And in a debate over the nature of communion, Luther argued that the service was more than just a remembrance of the act of Christ, and so Zwingli asserted that it was only a memorial. And so they failed to resolve their differences over this issue, and the conference adjourned without reaching an overall agreement between the Lutherans and the Zwinglians. And the failure of the Marburg colloquy was troubling for Hesse and Luther, but devastating to Zwingli, who desperately needed these allies. So in October of 1531, war breaks out between the Protestant and Catholic cantons in Switzerland. Zwingli himself is going to fight in the battles. He becomes known as the crusading priest. His army was defeated in the Second Battle of Kappel, and he was wounded and captured, and opposing troops killed him, cut his body into pieces, burned them, and scattered his ashes. Switzerland was left a country of two religions after this. And then we have John Calvin. John Calvin was a native of France. He did not begin his academic training until 1523, and after having a conversion experience that pushed him in the direction of Reformation ideas, he left France, which was a predominantly Catholic country, because he feared persecution. And so he ends up in Geneva, Switzerland, where he made a name for himself as a reformer. And in 1536, he wrote Institutes of the Christian Religion, a synthesis of his religious concepts. And he eventually established a ministry in Geneva and hoped to one day create a theocracy based on his ideas. So what were Calvin's theological ideas? Let's look at those. Calvin was convinced that a person could never really truly know if they were saved. Consequently, he believed that the individual had to lead a deeply devoted and spiritual life to keep focused on the possibility of salvation in the afterlife. So Calvin's theology focused on the issue of predestination and the elect. He believed that God had already chosen who would be allowed into heaven, which he called the elect, and who would not. And because a person couldn't be certain if they were part of the elect, or every person had to diligently maintain this type of life. Free will wasn't a factor in his thinking because it would detract from the sovereignty of God. And Calvin taught that there was value in hard work. And this is a principle that Max Weber, in his book The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, argues was a spark to modern day capitalism. And that's what we're going to be talking about in our next project, capitalism. So keep that in mind. Calvin believed that consubstantiation, the elements of communion, assumed mystical properties. He favored collective communal discipline, exercised either privately or publicly if necessary. So let's look at this idea of predestination. T was total depravity, meaning that humans are sinful and can't save themselves. U, unconditional election. People are chosen for salvation not because of anything they have done, and whether one gets saved depends solely on God's will. L, limited atonement, that some are chosen. We call those the elect. I, irresistible grace. Members of the elect will not be able to resist the call of God. And P, perseverance of the saints. An afterlife exists for the elect, and once they have received grace, they cannot lose it. Calvin convinced the City Council of Geneva to implement the ideas that are contained within his ecclesiastical orders, and he created a special administrative body known as the Consistory to implement and monitor the morality of the citizens of Geneva. The Consistory had the authority to pass ordinances, as well as to punish those who violated the ordinances or who led immoral or undisciplined lives. So we had a very strict moral code in Geneva under John Calvin. So let's look at Calvin's moral code. His moral code covered behaviors that the city expected from its citizens, and the council could hand out discipline and punishment as they saw necessary. So these were designed to promote communal morality. No plays, dancing, or drinking. Fortune telling was banned. Punishments for merchants who cheated their customers. Taverns were banned. Cafes were permitted if a Bible was present, and lewd songs and playing cards were forbidden. There was a penalty for praising the Pope. Penalties for laughing during a sermon or failing to take communion. The consistory determined who could marry, and the consistory legislated daily behavior, such as how many dishes could be served at each meal, what color of clothes a person could wear, and so forth. Geneva became known as Protestant Rome, as reformers from all over Europe were going to flock to the city for training and education. They then take the principles and ideas they'd learned back to their homelands, helping spread Calvinism across the continent. Significant Calvinist communities are going to arise in France, the Netherlands, Scotland. French Calvinists were known as Huguenots. They suffered severe persecution under King Henry II, who was a Catholic. Calvinism soon became the dominant faith in the Netherlands, which lay under the nominal control of King Philip II of Spain, who was also Catholic, and this would eventually lead to some problems. The Anabaptists rejected infant baptism because they felt that the ritual should be reserved for those old enough to make their own decisions about religion. And in addition, because the movement stressed that all believers were equal, it focused less on material wealth, a fact which made Anabaptism attractive to members of the lower classes. And since both Protestants and Catholics retained the practice of infant baptism, the Anabaptists are going to be persecuted by both groups. At the Diet of Speyer, Charles V made Anabaptism punishable by death. Michael Sattler, an Anabaptist who belonged to the Swiss Brethren in Zurich, composed a document known as the Schlittersheim Articles, which provided the first formal confession of faith for Anabaptists. Slatter was later tried for heresy and convicted and burned at the stake. So what did these Anabaptists believe? Well, Anabaptists saw the church as a voluntary community of the faithful people. You could not be born into the church, nor could they belong to it simply because their family or community positions. Anabaptists also believe that government should not play any role in religion, nor did it have any authority over true Christians. And that was one thing that separated them, that had the Catholic Church and government had intertwined themselves for centuries prior to this. Um, their position on the relationship between the church and the state, it differs radically from other Protestant groups as well. And so, rather than linking politics and the religion of the community, the Anabaptists call for the separation of the two. Anabaptists advocated for a strict moral code and stressed humility. Swearing, alcohol, and outward displays of emotion were all discouraged. One of the earliest Anabaptist groups were the Swiss Brethren in Zurich. However, Zwingli expelled the group from the city because he views them as a threat to his beliefs. So, the radical Anabaptists in Munster. Several very radical Anabaptist groups come to the city in Germany because of its toleration. It was viewed as the New Jerusalem, and they managed to gain control of the city by force. They expelled all unbelievers and made all things communal, including spouses. And the radical leader, John of Leyden, you'll sometimes see it spelled with a Y, proclaimed himself ruler of the kingdom of Munster, and he based his governance on the doctrine of justification by faith, arguing that people should be allowed to live according to their consciences rather than any earthly laws. He still brutally enforced religious doctrine, however, executing several transgressors, and Munster becomes anarchical and repressive during his 18-month reign. And finally, a joint Protestant Catholic army laid siege to the city, captured it, and executed the leaders of the Anabaptists. Another group that we see appear during this time, the Mennonites. After the Munster incident, many Anabaptists feel the need to separate themselves from the outside world so that they could focus more strongly on spiritual matters. Well, Menno Simons, a popular Anabaptist leader in the Netherlands, led a branch of Anabaptism dedicated to pacifism. If you don't know what pacifism is, that's peace, okay? They're not going to fight. They're going to be very peaceful people. And in doing so, he's going to keep the Anabaptist movement alive in the Low Countries after this Munster incident. So Simmons' Anabaptist branch became known as the Mennonites, named after him, and spread throughout Europe and even eventually as they migrate into North America. You still see pockets of these today. A lot of times they're up in the Northeast. We sometimes confuse them with the Amish, which are a different group. Let's look at some discussion questions from this section. Zwingli, like other Reformation leaders, opposed many church rituals and the use of images and music. For him, religious ceremonies should stress preaching and reading the Bible and other religious writings. Why do you think the Reformers put so much stress on the written word as opposed to religious doctrines, images, and music? Number 2, Calvin's stress on predestination is often misunderstood. Many say it would lead people to give up trying to do good and live a holy life, but in fact, it often did lead people to work very hard to live holy lives and never sin. Can you explain why people make this mistake about Calvin's concept of predestination, and why does it make people especially anxious to live holy lives? Number 3, why do you think Catholics and other Protestants alike were so harsh in their criticism of Anabaptists and so willing to punish them severely?